When Johnny asked me to say something about giving, the words that first came to mind were, "All things come from you, and of your own do we give you." It seems a good place to start in any testimony about giving. For a start, do we really mean what we've just said? The words are easy to say, less easy to put into practice. Do we really believe that everything we have, our home, our job if we have one, our pension if we have one, our exam success or our recent promotion, all of our wealth and all of our talents, do they really belong to God? Don't we often think some of it, at least, is due to our own efforts? I know for myself that I'm constantly at risk of forgetting that everything I have comes from God. Some words of Jesus that I was reminded of as I thought about what to say were, "Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." You can find them in both Matthew 6 verse 21 and the identical words in Luke 12 verse 34. Note the order of what Jesus says. It's where my treasure is that my heart will be also. So what are my own experience of giving? I've titled this testimony in my own mind as A Tale of Two Redundancies, and I hope my experience of being made redundant twice, once compulsorily and once voluntarily, may at least help some of you to think about what God is asking you to do about giving. The first time I was made redundant, it came out of the blue and was a complete shock. It wasn't something I had plans for, not least because, as one recruitment consultant told me, "You'll never get another job at your age." I was just 47 at the time, but accountancy is increasingly skewed towards younger people, so finance directors are often the youngest on the board. Jackie and I already relied on my income entirely, since she had given up a part-time job a few years earlier, so my redundancy had implications for her too. We had to decide what to do about our giving, both to our church and to several other charities that we supported on a monthly basis. We decided that, as I'd been given a substantial redundancy payment, we continue to support both our church and the other charities at the same level. I looked for work, and although I had several interviews, there were no jobs forthcoming. Eventually, in the midst of the quiet summer holiday period, I saw a job advertised that really appealed. I went for an interview in Guildford, then a day with a whole series of group and individual exercises with 11 others in London, and finally I was called back for a final selection meeting with my future boss and a national finance colleague. In all this, I learnt that God will provide, even when we are worried about our finances. And I also learnt that God is a very generous giver. My new job was not only permanent, it was better paid and had more responsibility than my old job. But I said this was a tale of two redundancies, and I wouldn't want you to get the impression that God only works by giving you better, and better paid, jobs. My second redundancy was 8 years ago, and I volunteered for it after Jackie and I had prayed, done a lot of financial calculations about whether we could afford for me to retire early. This time there was no redundancy payment. Instead, in order to make up for the fact I was retiring before the organisation's retirement age, I actually had to pay them so I could avoid having my pension reduced. Thankfully, I had some money I'd inherited from my father, and so I was able to do this, which made a real difference. Given that my dad had threatened to disinherit me after I became a Christian, it was lovely to see the way our later reconciliation and Dad's own conversion ultimately made it possible for me to retire early. That was just another way of God giving to me. Anyway, this time it was clear Jackie and I could not possibly continue to give at the same level on an income that was less than half what it had been when I was working. Therefore we sat down, reviewed all our commitments, and in one case took the hard decision to stop giving to that organisation altogether, while in the case of our church and other charities, we sought to give a similar proportion of our income. In the case of our church, in fact, we gave a slightly higher proportion of our income than before, as we exactly halved the amount that we gave when I was working. Thanks to God's generosity, we're now giving a higher proportion than before I retired, and we've been able to start to give again to the organisation we had to stop giving to when I first took redundancy. So what have I learned from these two redundancies about God's generosity? The first thing is that how much you give starts with prayer. How much to give, or rather, how much to retain for ourselves, because we're just stewards of all that God has given us, has to begin with prayer. Sometimes the answer will be to give in faith, expecting he will provide, as he did when I ended up with a better paid job after being unemployed for several months. On other occasions, it may mean choosing to live at a lower standard of living with a reduced income, but still giving proportionately, or perhaps, like the widow that Bishop Joe spoke about last week, giving a far greater proportion than we think possible. One thing I've learned in all my time as a believer is we cannot outgive God. If we give to him regularly, he will bless us with more, as Jackie and I have found, particularly since I retired. But then we shouldn't be surprised that we cannot outgive God. After all, he gave us his Son, so that through his death we might be saved from our sin. We can never give a gift as great as that.